This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Giovanni, Shiloh, Manisha, and Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Giovanni, and with me is Monisha. Thank you for being with us today.
Happy
How are
to
you
be
doing,
here.
Monisha?
I'm good. Just chilling, hanging in there like everybody.
Okay. Good, yeah. Well, thank you for joining us. We have a special guest today, and we'll introduce him in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about the Monroe Doctrine. On December the 2nd, 2023, the controversial and notorious Monroe Doctrine turned 200 years old. The Monroe Doctrine is considered a significant U.S. foreign policy statement articulated by President James Monroe in his 7th annual message to Congress on December the 2nd, 1823. There are four main points to the Monroe Doctrine. One, it warned European nations against further interference in the Western Hemisphere. Two, it established the Western Hemisphere as the United States' sphere of influence. Three, it stated that the American continent will no longer be open for new colonization by European powers. And four, the U.S. pledged not to interfere in existing European colonies. The initial reaction to this proclamation from the Latin America intelligentsia and pro-sovereignty nationalist circles was positive. Many of these newly established states in Latin America were either gaining their independence from Europe or were in the process of gaining their independence and envisioned a united American bloc against Europe. Eyebrows rose, however, during the Mexican-American War in 1840-1848, when Mexico lost half of its territories to the United States. The doctrine was formulated to address immediate concerns, but became a cornerstone of U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt added his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, justifying American interventions in Latin America anytime the U.S. saw its interests threatened. It has been acted upon both implicitly and explicitly. The American Doctrine has been invoked many times throughout history, more recently by former National Security Advisor and United States Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, in 2019 when he issued threats to Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, calling them the Troika of tyranny, before announcing new sanctions and declaring the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. On August 28, Venezuela had a national election, and the United States has refused to recognize the results, just like they refused to recognize the elections before this one and the one before. Washington's candidate didn't win. As a result, more punitive measures have been imposed, including re-sanctioning Venezuelan oil and the confiscation of the Venezuelan presidential airplane by American agents while in maintenance in the Dominican Republic. Indeed, Washington has scrutinized every Venezuelan electoral victory of the Socialist Party for the past 20 years, calling them fraudulent while backing the most extreme elements of Venezuela's right-wing reactionaries, people like Maria Corina Machado and Leopoldo Lopez, despite international election observers saying otherwise. Even former President Jimmy Carter said in 2012 that the Venezuelan electoral process was the best in the world. Yet American authorities had problems then with the Venezuelan election results. So where is the disconnect? Why the obsession with Venezuela and its democratic elections? I want to introduce you to someone who was on the ground during these past elections to share his experience as an international election observer, someone who knows the country and has been an observer in the past Venezuelan elections, Dr. Bahman Azad. Dr. Azad, thank you for coming to the show. Can you first tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what is your connection to Venezuela?
My connection with I'm president of United States Peace Council, and I've been serving as the executive secretary for decades. And then recently, with the passing of our president, I was elected as the president of Peace Council.
Mm-hmm.
But our connection to Venezuela goes way, way back because, first of all, Venezuela, the Peace and Solidarity Committee of Venezuela has always been a member, one of the founding members of the World Peace Council very early on. And as a sister organization to us, we have been cooperating with them for a long time, not related to elections, but about everything else as well. We have been going to Venezuela for the meetings of the World Peace Council and other events in solidarity for a long time. So I've been very much involved in what is going on in Venezuela and support and solidarity with Venezuela. As a part of that, we have been regularly invited by the Venezuelan Electoral Council to participate in the elections as election observers, international observers. We have been going to the elections early on, the beginning time. And we have been observing those elections. We are closely tied to Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution, fully support that. And as U.S. Peace Council, and also since U.S. Peace Council is a member of the Secretariat of the World Peace Council, as the World Peace Council also. That has been our ties for a long time. And now, too, we stand in solidarity with Venezuela regarding all the conspiracies that are being hatched against the government of President Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution there.
What motivated you to become an election observer?
To me, it wasn't a personal motivation. It was generally invitation as a responsibility to go, because I don't think Venezuelan elections needs any international observers to begin with. This is an internal matter to the people of Venezuela, and international observers have become necessary just because U.S. is interfering.
Right.
And it is from that point of view that it is our responsibility, historical responsibility, to go in there, observe the process, and testify that all of the claims against Venezuelan government and its electoral process are false and lies, and that they need to be corrected.
It's interesting you say that, because both President Jimmy Carter was an election observer back in, I believe, 2012. And he said that the electoral process in Venezuela was the best in the world. Also, former president of Spain, Jose Zapatero, was also an election observer, I believe, in 2020. He said that he didn't see any irregularities in the elections, and he validated the elections. Yet, people in Washington and mainstream media, both the Venezuelan opposition in Venezuela and the Venezuelan opposition in Miami, Florida, always contest these elections, saying they've been fraudulent and yada, yada, yada. So do you want to comment on that?
As I mentioned, Venezuelan electoral process does not need any confirmation. I have been there. We have been there many times, and we had witnessed it. It's not necessarily just the people who, like President Carter, who say that, but the very process itself testifies to that. Like, all governments have three branches of the government, right? Executive, legislature, and judiciary. Venezuela has five. And the electoral branch is the fourth, an independent branch of the government whose leadership is elected. It is not a subsystem of the government or executive of the branch of the government. So it's not taking orders from the executive branch. It's supposed to be an independent entity whose job only is to supervise and observe and manage the electoral process in the country at all levels. It's their job to watch over these processes and to make sure that all the proper rules and regulations are observed. I myself have been there, and this time there were two groups of international observers. I think every time it was like that. One was, they call them kind of official or legal observers, which many of them are officials of various governments, are various international institutions like UN, other places. And then there's the general international observers that they are invited by the CNE to participate. I was one of the very few people who were selected to attend the meetings of official observers, briefing meetings. And one of them, which was almost half a day, the CNE, directors of the CNE, all 4 or 5 of them were there present. And they were briefing the international observers, official observers, about the process, how it works. It was a 4-hour presentation by one of the rectors. I think it was the deputy of the CNE through audio-visual guides, all mechanisms of process from the very beginning. The first step to the last step was outlined, how the system works. First of all, the system is fully computerized in advanced high-tech level, which nobody can tamper. Okay, nobody can tamper. Secondly, on top of the electronic process, they have a physical process, which is the person who enters the polling place. First, they check the identity. They check his ID card or her ID card and make sure that this is the person who has the right to vote. Second, after that is confirmed, the computer allows them to vote. When they vote, there is a printout. The machine gives them a printout that says such and such person voted for such and such candidate. Okay. Unlike the US that just printout says thank you for voting. It tells you who you voted for. That's a confirmation. That is how it's registered in the machine. Now, they want them to put their fingerprint on that slip, on that receipt. They get a fingerprint of the voter, put it on that receipt, and then put it in the ballot box. Now, the counting goes on according to the machine, not to the physical slips. The physical slips are only there for audits. Mm-hmm. No system, for example, in the US, if you have somebody wants to confirm the elections, they have to apply for an audit. One of the parties should ask for an audit and pay for it and whatever else to go through the process. And usually not all of the votes are counted. Mm-hmm. They go by samples. And that sample is usually 10%, 15% in the areas that are being challenged. By law, Venezuela automatically runs an audit of 50% of all votes. That's on top of others requesting it, like last time when they challenged the election results and the whole process was started with CNE and then went to this Supreme Court of Justice and all that. This is just within the CNE, these things are happening. And then after that, if anybody still does not believe that, they call for counting of the vote. And then that, if anybody challenges that, it goes to the Supreme Court. So that's the whole process, layer upon layer of check and balances and audit and everything else. So there is no way that anybody could cheat on this electoral process. They could cheat by staging a cybernetic attack on the electoral system computers, which the US did in the middle and caused a lot of reporting to be delayed. And then the opposition used that delay as, oh, they're hiding the votes and they're not saying anything about their final results, because the only time that they can announce it officially and confirm is after all the votes have been reported and every computer system has been shut down and all the reports have been done. And with the cyber attack that they managed to do against the system, they created all the delays and everything else that caused all those complaints. But even with that, President Maduro himself took it to the Supreme Court and asked for a legal judgment about that, right?
And they also called the case of the opposition who was running against Maduro, but he never showed. You know?
That's exactly right. Because the main candidate who was challenging the elections refused to submit the data they had on the election on their part to be compared to what is on the records. Exactly. They refused to hand in. They claimed that according to our data, election is stolen, but they refused to hand in the data.
Exactly. They also have. Then they also create like a parallel website to tally the election. Yeah. I think it was created in Florida, and the website ran from Florida, and they have like their own results from the elections.
So that was the thing, is it was part of the strategy. Uh-huh. They would go to exit polls and create fake exit polls showing that their candidate is winning, so they can use it afterwards as a proof that the election is stolen. It was a conscious strategy of
Mhm.
developing these fake data publicly and influencing people's minds. Their claim is based on those fake exit polls that they had. And they use it at the end to say that our data shows this and that, right? While refusing to show the data, where it came from.
Yeah, and Monisha, you also accompanied Dr. Azad in 2020, right? Can you share some of your experience during that event?
Sure. Yeah. So I was there for the 2020 national elections. There with Bahman on a delegation from the U.S. Peace Council. As a social worker at the time, I was working on my dissertation where I was investigating and interrogating the U.S.'s use of propaganda, psychological warfare, etc. For folks listening, my doctorate is in psychology. So I was pushing back on the military psychological industrial complex through that academic exercise. I wanted to go and be able to talk to just the voters. I was interested in the processes that um, Bauman just described, but I was also interested in how do the people who are going to the polling places feel? How are the interactions there? We were able to talk to whomever we wanted to. There was no one standing over us with a gun threatening us or anything like that. It was very free. I spoke with people who were not fans of the Maduro administration. I spoke with people who were fans of the Maduro administration. I talked to them about how did they find the voting process for them. I talked to people who were elders who were accompanied to vote. I talked to people who were wheelchair bound who were accompanied by others through a voting process. I asked questions specifically pertaining to how are people's access to the polls protected. I asked about how people with various types of learning disabilities or other things that may impede them from being able to use the machine or view the screen, how are they assisted and how are their rights protected in the process of being assisted? So for me, it was important to look at that aspect of the voting process as well as the higher level geopolitical issues that were at play. And what I really respected about it was that a lot of the people told me that they finally had access to polling stations after Chavez, that there was a huge effort to expand accessibility for voters because prior to him, there was even more limited access, geographically speaking. And so, with that expansion, that helped people have greater access to a more participatory democratic process, as well as the protections that are in place for folks who, like I was mentioning, a person in a wheelchair. The checks and balances that Bauman described extend in a more fine way to that, so that the person that is accompanying them, they have to have consent to be able to press a button on behalf of the person who maybe can't reach it. The poll workers themselves, I got to talk to them, and these are just community members. These are not people who are high level members of government that can be accused of meddling in anything. These are just folks from the neighborhood who are there at their local polling station, and they're the ones in charge of the polling station. They're
Volunteers.
the one, yes, and they're the ones before the voting day. There are multiple processes to verify how the machines are functioning. We were able to view how that process took place at a couple different polling stations prior to voting day. We were able to ask questions. There was lots of international press present as well during that. It was very free. There was a military presence. I talked to some of the folks that were in uniform there and asked them, what is it that you're doing here? Why are you required to be here? And it was because there was a high level of anticipation that the opposition was going to do some shenanigans.
Hmm.
And so they were there to also safeguard the people's right to vote. What I witnessed was no interference on the part of anyone who was wearing a uniform in the voting process. They were only there as a deterrent from any shenanigans and also to protect the voters, to protect access for the voters. So it was, to me, I would love to have seen this here in Puerto Rico. I think we need this in Puerto Rico. I think the system that Venezuela has in place to protect a people's right to participate in how their lives essentially are governed and managed, how policies are developed, we need that here. The level of protection that's in place, we need that here. We need international observers in Puerto Rico right now. And I agree with Bahman that ultimately it's an internal matter within Venezuela. It's sad to me that the only reason regular people like myself got invited to go and be an observer is because of the propaganda that comes from the
And Venezuela also has this uniformity in their election, in their process. Unlike the United States, every state, every county have their own processes. American voters are really confused in how the election worked. It was for a lot of people when Bush second, when he lost the popular vote back in 2000, but won the election, it was a surprise to a lot of Americans that the Electoral College that votes for the president, not necessarily the individual. Eye opening to a lot of Americans. They didn't know that. A lot of Americans didn't know that. How they keep drafting the lines here, political lines here to make sure certain party always win here in the United States, particularly Texas, the way they do in Texas to keep Texas red. They keep drawing the lines and they keep doing all these shenanigans and whatnot. But in Venezuela, more uniform process. And I'm sorry I cut you off, Benicia. Go ahead, finish.
Yeah, that's okay. It's like we're just chatting anyways. The issue is US interventionism. That's the real problem. There are always going to be issues within a nation as the people themselves attempt to work together to determine their future. There's going to be people who want to maintain power and dominance and their ability to exploit others. And there's always going to be that conflict that exists within a nation as the people who are being exploited attempt to liberate themselves from that exploitation. And there is always going to be a need for checks and balances and to make sure that the right to a participatory democratic process is protected. But that is even harder to do when you have a settler imperial entity like the United States constantly digging their claws in and attempting to control the process according to their interests. And then when you have people within that nation who align with those imperial interests, who are basically opening the door and making an invitation for interference. That's
Yeah,
my
I want to ask both of you. Is there invite for observers, right? Is there any training involved? You get in the country the day before the election, or you're in the country several days before? How does that work?
Go ahead, Manisha. They do have it. We have to go through training. There are sessions before the elections for all the observers to be familiarized the process, how it works. They tell us what they expect us to watch and be careful about, all those things. Yes.
Yeah, I defer to you, Bahman, since you were there more recently and received that. What I recall most, and some of my memory of that time is affected by COVID. What I do remember was a lot of emphasis about our safety to make sure that we understood what was happening currently in between the opposition, between some of the potential violence that might occur from the opposition, and just to make sure that we respected that to keep us safe and to be good guests. Not like sometimes people go and they act entitled and they do whatever they want instead of adhering to the place that they are in and understanding you don't want to do certain things just because you're an American and you feel entitled to. You'd be creating a problem for yourself and for the people who are hosting. So I thought that was really important.
Do they break you guys in groups as you go in? How do you guys get from police station to police station?
Depending, in this time there was about 900 people there. So we were stationed in different hotels, and based on which hotel you were, they would split you into groups if you're too many, and put you in separate buses, and each bus has a schedule of covering certain number of polling stations. It's a process so that takes about 2/3 of the day going from one place to another
Mhm.
and observing the process everywhere. not all of us go to all of the voting places. There's thousands and thousands of them, and no way that you can go to all of them. Each group goes through a different set of them to observe.
Another thing that I thought was fantastic was that we went to different sectors of society. In Puerto Rico, we have the caseríos. We got to go to the more urban areas leading up to election day, meet with people, talk with people. We got to meet some of the local grassroots candidates that were running for the lower seats, hear about why their communities asked them to run. So we got to see how even we don't really get to experience that in Puerto Rico or in the US, where you have a truly grassroots involvement in a way that's supported and trusted. And then Nick Estes from Red Nation was also present, and a group got to go and see the indigenous voting areas, and they had their own elections as well. They're completely on separate election process. And so there was even an opportunity. I unfortunately was not on that bus, but there was an opportunity for people to go and participate in observing how indigenous life is preserved in the process as well.
Dr. Asada, Venezuela has been in the crosshairs of Uncle Sam since Chavez's election back in 1998. I was still in the military then, and I recall the media blitz around him, how he was mad and crazy and whatnot they were saying about him. He came with the politics to make fundamental changes to the socioeconomic landscape of this South American country. Chavez called his initiative the Bolivarian Revolution, named after the South American liberator Simon Bolivar. This caused a lot of tremors among the Venezuelan elite class and their foreign benefactors. Before Chavez, Venezuela had been a good, friendly state to the United States. Washington and Venezuela enjoyed a imperial vassal state relationship to each other. For decades, Uncle Sam enjoyed the steadfast influence over Venezuela. Venezuela, I think, he imported like 80% of everything that they consumed in Venezuela. Chavez represented a spoiler. Him coming to power represented a spoiler to this relationship. For context, for people to know what Chavez was, he was a popular Venezuelan leader and one of a handful of leftist leaders that were ascend to power in the 2000s, along with several other Latin American leaders and who the United States nominated as a pink tide. Chavez's radical politics nationalized the Venezuelan oil industry and would use the proceeds to pursue ambitious social, economic, and infrastructure projects with the poverty reduction program at the center of his politics. To witness the highest price of crude oil in the world, and poverty in Venezuela was reduced by 40%, with extreme poverty by 75%. Chavez initiated several pan-regionalist projects that included institutions meant for more regional solidarity and economic and political integration and less reliance on the U.S. and Europe. Chavez promoted the idea of creating a regional currency to reduce the influence of the U.S. dollar in Latin America and help found institutions like the ALBA, which is the Bolivarian Alliance for Peoples of America, the CELAC, which is the Community of Latin America and Caribbean States, and the Union of South American Nations, the UNASUR. All right, this was supposed to offshoot the OAS, which is the Organization of American States, an institution created by the United States after the Second World War. Chavez also initiated politics that reached out to other global actors like China, Russia, and Iran, and would pursue his vision of South-to-South relations, meaning more intimate relations among global majority countries that would eventually lead to a better resource-distributed world, a multipolar world, with an ultimate goal of a pluripolar world. Chavez died of cancer in 2013 and named his successor Nicolas Maduro. Maduro will be interim president until new elections were organized, and in 2014 he would win a thin majority against right-wing opposition leader Enrique Capriles. That year, they issued La Salida, or the ouster, was announced by the right wing to oust Maduro from power, and immediately riots and barricades known as guarimbas would paralyze Caracas for weeks. We know now that there was a lot of Washington NGO funding behind these opposition politicians, rioters, and guarimberos, with Obama once boasting that millions of dollars were going to Venezuela for democracy promotion. Obama would declare Venezuela an unusual threat to the United States and impose sanctions, and Trump will impose maximum pressure sanctions to cripple the Venezuelan economy and cause a regime change. Dr. Azad, the U.S. promoted far-right candidate Maria Corina Machado was banned from running due to past misdeeds like conspiring with a foreign government and attempting to overthrow the sitting president. She had a gentleman by the name of Emundo Gonzalez as her surrogate candidate. Gonzalez lost to a 43% vote count to Maduro's 51%. Explain what you saw on the ground compared to what the Western media was projecting at the time.
I think the results show what was going on. That the President Maduro had the support of the majority of the people. You could see it in the street demonstrations that the two sides organized. You could see that a few thousand in some block somewhere would protest in support of opposition, and the tens of thousands on the other block. The day after the election, it was most visible where the support in the society and the community stands with the two candidates. It was very clear to us from the beginning. People were so enthusiastic about Maduro. Every community, every place we saw, there was no way, even from the manifestations on the streets, this claim that they have the support of 70% of the population can have any validity. There's no way. Technicalities aside from the point of view electoral process, the realities on the ground showed the opposite to the claims. It was very clear. The enthusiasm was all over the place. People were even celebration after the victory was unbelievable.
Yeah. So go ahead, Manisha, you mentioned interference, how it impacts the fairness of Venezuela's presidential election. How do you see this as an obstacle for the true process in Venezuela?
You and I have spent a lot of time working together on hybrid warfare and talking about specifically the way psychological warfare plays into that. And for me, what I look at most is how the attempts to interfere on all levels, if we look at the aspects of hybrid warfare, the aspects of psychological warfare that are at play, you have the manipulation of the public. And not everyone is going to agree with their government's policy. Not everyone is going to agree with the way their elected officials run things. That's just par for the course in any government system anywhere. Everyone has different perspectives on what would make things better, what would improve their lives. Oftentimes, where there are dissatisfactions with the way things are being done or handled, depending on a person's vantage point from their place in society, those points of dissatisfaction or distrust, or wherever there are vulnerabilities within the society itself, particularly in the more vulnerable sectors of that society, the more exploited sectors of that society, then you have an undermining of trust, you have an undermining of confidence in the process itself. So, in that way, it causes harm. It can harm families, it can harm communities who may stand to benefit from particular policies that will affect their lives that come from, regardless of who is at the helm. Oftentimes, people will focus on the particular figure who is elected. In this case, it's Maduro, instead of looking at the larger picture of how are the people protected by the public policies that are created by the entire party. And important for the people to maintain confidence at the minimum, and regardless of whatever dissatisfactions may exist. And again, I want to reiterate that it is an internal thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not for, I'm not Venezuelan. I don't live there. So it's not for me to lob a criticism because I'm not impacted by those policies personally. I don't understand how people's dissatisfaction may form. In terms of interventionism, however, I think it's important that people remember that's for them to work out. And when you have a force like the United States coming in and stoking flames of discontent, you have them using bochinche, using gossip, as Bahman was mentioning, and you yourself, Giovanni, were mentioning that external interference by the opposition forces that are being housed and supported within the U.S., particularly Florida. And you have the misinformation campaigns that are taking place that can also reach back to the families, to the people, the individuals who may be experiencing some discontent, and that can help influence and shape their own trajectory. You also have the use of the anti-electoral front. So in Puerto Rico, here we have an anti-electoral front which doesn't always work in our favor in terms of independence. But in Venezuela, you also had the creation of an anti-electoral front where people were essentially going to boycott the election. Primarily, people in the opposition were going to boycott the election, and they were calling for other people to boycott the election and using a lot of the same strategies to try and influence. It was an influence campaign to get people to not participate. Because if you have lowered participation in voting, then you can further delegitimize or attempt to delegitimize the outcomes of that vote. Unfortunately, that does not work here in Puerto Rico, where you have bare minimum voter participation, and yet still you have the dominant party that is wreaking havoc on our lives here still in power. In the case of Venezuela, it was used as an attempt to undermine the participation of voters who may, in fact, regardless of whatever dissatisfactions may exist with their lived experience, still vote for the
That's the ruling part.
ruling party. Yes, or party that's in power, People's Party, however people want to put it. So yeah, that's another way that interference can undermine the outcomes and ultimately undermine the daily lives of the people. And then you have the internal pressures that come from the external pressures of sanctions and all of that economic warfare that Venezuela has been experiencing for a long time, which weighs on also the daily lives of the people.
Yeah, I was going to say that just for both of you, the issue of sanction here in the United States, sanction is so abstract. Many Americans don't understand what sanction is. Even many Latin Americans don't understand how sanction work. Even many Latin Americans that come from countries that come from sanctioned countries don't understand how sanction work. And for their precarities, but they don't know how sanction is affecting the outcome on the ground. I say impose about 930 unilateral coercive measures on sanctions on Venezuela, making Venezuela the second most sanctioned country after Russia. In your experience going to Venezuela, how did you see this play out on the ground, the sanctions regime?
In several ways. One thing that people don't recognize is that even that 40% of votes for opposition is because of the sanctions in many ways, because the same dissatisfaction that is created by those sanctions leads people to hang on to something that would represent some change. Maybe, hopefully, things will change with this one. In a way, that 40%, I would say probably majority of it is sanction generated also. There is a type of interference in the process in an indirect way of moving people in the direction of being desperately looking for a solution to the problem that they have, not knowing that it is coming from outside. They refocus it on the present leadership of the country and say, okay, all your hardships are coming from these people. And as a result, you better, if you want some change, vote for somebody else. And one of the discussions we had with some of our comrades, I raised this issue that even in an open electoral process, even if they didn't challenge anything, the very fact that there is a 40% vote for us opposition, which is created by the CIA and the sanctions and everything else, is used as a weapon to challenge the legitimacy of the government. To say, gee, if the government is so good, why do they have 40% opposition vote?
Yeah.
They never talk about the effects of these sanctions as a weapon that is doing this. So this interference it's at all levels, direct funding of the opposition, moving the opposition towards not a democratic process, but which is aimed at overthrowing the government. It's not aimed at electoral process. That is why from the beginning they say they don't recognize, they are not going to recognize the results of it. They don't accept the results of the election. They refuse to bring any document. The ultimate objective is to legitimize the government, as Anisha mentioned. And sanctions are doing this. That's one of the effective ways of doing that. It generates enough opposition votes so that they can claim the government doesn't have the support.
Exactly.
It's not true.
Yeah, and I just want to iterate an example of how sanctions work. During COVID, there was a crisis in medical equipment in Venezuela because of the sanctions. The Venezuelan government attempted to purchase ventilators, a Swedish company, to buy ventilators to bring to Venezuela. An American company bought that Swedish company, so they won't be able to sell to Venezuela, right? The next step, the Venezuelan government attempted to buy ventilators through a third party. I think Portugal gave Portugal the money. Yeah, because they couldn't, because of sanctions, they can't use electronic transactions and the funds can be tracked. And then there's a thing called secondary sanctions, is that if you do business with a sanctioned country, then your company be sanctioned as well. So people try to avoid secondary sanctions. So they work in cash and whatnot. The Venezuelan government gave money to Portugal, so Portugal can then purchase the ventilators for Venezuela. Then Portugal, where the ventilator will make its way to Venezuela. And I think during that time, Trump identified Maduro as a narco trafficker. He accused it and put a bounty of $15 million on his head, whatever, this and that, right? So now the Portuguese government said, well, we can't do business, so we're not going to purchase this ventilator. And by the way, we want to keep the money too.
Yeah, I was there and got to experience. So when they were testing us constantly, their biosecurity, I have to again take my hat off to Venezuela's way of trying to protect people from COVID. We were being regularly tested. They had strict biosecurity in place, masking, sanitizing. They had workers in the hotel where we were staying going through with pumps with mist to sanitize surfaces. Somehow or another, I still ended up contracting, I think, during traveling to Venezuela was when I contracted it, and I tested positive on election day after we had already visited the sites. And I believe we had been tested twice before election day, once en route and once again when we arrived. Their protocol was excellent. I was moved into quarantine immediately. They hosted my stay of almost a month. I was hospitalized for 6 days. Thankfully, because of the preventative care that they provided, which is the opposite of what happens in the US and the opposite of what happens here in Puerto Rico, I believe that I survived. They were also receiving help from Cuban doctors, and I got to receive that. But what was interesting is, so I think a lot of people, particularly in the US, because of the propaganda, don't know that even though there is movement toward a shift toward a more socialist economic and political system in Venezuela, that not everything there is socialist. There's still a lot of private enterprise, including healthcare. And so the hospital that I was taken to was not a private hospital, it was a community hospital. And so the conditions within that hospital were a lot different than the private hospitals where you still have to have insurance and pay a lot of money. Um, they did not have an x-ray machine to be able to x-ray anyone's lungs. And so that was very difficult for them. And even while I was in that condition there, I was talking to some of the healthcare workers and some of the other patients about life in Venezuela. One person who helped me a lot passed away while we were hospitalized together, unfortunately. And I got to see how hard the nurses and the doctors tried to save her life. I think that is another really horrific way that the use of economic warfare essentially wreaks havoc on the daily lives of people there, to the extent that, as Bahman was, they will vote for wherever they think change will come from that will make their lives a little bit easier. So when people talk about sanctions, I think there needs to be more humanization of what that means on the ground and what that means in the day-to-day lives of the people who ultimately are the ones being affected by the sanctions. It's not necessarily just government officials or business owners. It's folks, it's children, it's mothers, it's siblings that are being harmed. Also access to food, access to essential services, right? There was sabotage of the electrical system as well. So imagine all of that during COVID, when people are even more vulnerable, even more susceptible to fear, pain, and are going to become even more desperate during those times for change. And then you have the economic impact of COVID on top of the economic impact of economic warfare, and you have even more desperation. The ambulance ride to the hospital was hectic because of gas lines. So everything gets affected. It's all connected, and everything gets affected from even that one seemingly benign aspect of warfare that the US is imposing or aggressing against the people of Venezuela. And I want people to really take that home. That's Maduro is not the one that the US is ultimately aiming to hurt. It's the people that the US wants to control. And it's the people that the US is willing to sacrifice in order for it to take control over the resources, which includes the labor resources in Venezuela. Just like they do to us in Puerto Rico, just like they do to us in the US, they will do whatever they want to us in order to maintain control over us, in order to put us in a position where we feel like we have to do what they say.
Can I add to what the important point that Manisha from human side of it, human side raised? I think one aspect of the sanctions that people have to pay attention to is the so-called smart aspect of the sanctions, because they call them smart sanctions. There is a reason for it. These sanctions are not comprehensive. Every entity in Venezuela or any country that is under sanctions is equally affected. The purpose of these sanctions is openly, as formulated, to strengthen the private sector as opposed to the government and public sector. They are sanctioning all the entities that are one way or another related or working with the government. Companies that work with the government closely, companies that sell stuff to the government, companies that operate on behalf of government in terms of production are sanctions. But companies belonging to the opposition sector that are not dealing with the government are free to do the trade. This means that at the time that government public sector is being constricted, the private sector is allowed to expand in the face of it and replace the areas that the government is not active in anymore. When we were there in, I think, 2018 or something, we organized a delegation of peace movement leaders, U.S. Peace Council did, very early on in support of President Maduro. There was members of various organizations in the U.S., leaders of the organizations that were there, Veterans for Peace. Jerry Condon was there and a few others, Code Pink, Popular Resistance, everybody almost. We witnessed this effect because they set up meetings with government officials for us, for them to explain the situation in Venezuela. And one of the places we visited was the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Health official, I think it was one of the deputy ministers that was talking, explained to us that before the sanctions, Venezuela produced about 84% of this it needed internally. By the time we were there, as a result of the sanctions, this relationship was reversed because the main ingredients of the drugs they used were banned from entering Venezuela. And more, the government of Venezuela was forced to depend on private sector to provide. In a sense, by the time we were there, years later after sanctions began, the relationship was reversed. That is, about 80% or 90% of the medical needs, medicine for Venezuela was in the hand of private sector. The same they had done with the food sector. Now, I want to say that this sanction is not just to suppress Venezuela as a whole, but also strengthen the private sector opposition against the government economically. And as more areas of economy becomes controlled by the private sector by force, then they gain a political power to negotiate with the government and pressure the government on various policies. And the interesting thing is, when the government of Maduro decides for the protection of the Bolivarian revolution to negotiate with the opposition, which is the doing of the United States by creating these smart sanctions that brings that opposition to a point that the government is forced to negotiate with to protect the Bolivarian revolution. We have to understand, not look at the symptoms of the things and the processes, but look at the real causes of the processes behind them. Because if you look at it that way, you will see where that comes from. Who strengthened the opposition to the point that the government was forced to negotiate with them over things? It's the sanctions, very conscious policy of the sanctions. So we are not just dealing with the sanctions affecting the elections or health problems. Balance of forces in the country are being changed as a result. That's the intention. And we have to be aware of that. And this is not only Venezuela. They're doing to Nicaragua, they're doing to Cuba, they're doing to Iran, they're doing to all countries that are resisting the United States. And I think we should also see the link between all of them. It's not just one country targeted. It's all resistance movement targeted.
Yeah, that was excellent. That was brilliant. You just mentioned Nicaragua, and this is precedent to the strategy that they're doing here. In the 79, revolutionaries overthrew the 40-year-old U.S.-backed dictatorship of Somoza, and they came to power, the Sandinistas. And immediately sanctions were put upon Nicaragua. They had elections in the mid-'80s, I believe, and they were given an ultimatum, either vote the right way or sanctions will continue. And the Nicaraguan population, the quote unquote, voted the wrong way. So they voted for Sandinistas again, right? So now the sanctions increased in Nicaragua. They started putting mines in the harbor. So ships come into Nicaragua with goods and everything. Then again, in 90, I believe it was 92, there was another election and the same ultimatum was given. Either vote the right way or sanctions will continue. This time around, they voted quote unquote the right way. So they voted for Violeta Chamorro. She was one of the people from the Nicaraguan elite families. So once she was voted in, miraculously overnight, sanctions disappeared. And the Nicaraguan system went from socialist to neoliberal in the 90s. That's what they're trying to achieve here. They haven't been able to do so, but that's what they're trying to achieve here. Not in Venezuela, like you said, Dr. Azad, also in Cuba and elsewhere. Try to rein these dissident countries in. Finally, do you believe the United States promotes its strategy, promotes what it's doing as benevolent, as promoting democracy? Whatever it does is promoting democracy, so it's benevolent. Unfortunately, some people get hurt in the process, but at the end of the day, it writes for a good cause, right? Do you believe that the United States' interests in Venezuela go beyond promoting democracy? And what lessons can countries take, countries that are trying to break away from this orbit, take from the Venezuelan experience?
You're a special guest.
The whole thing about the democracy is propaganda. We know that. I mean, they have shown it over and over again. Even if we take this bourgeois formal democracy that they are trying to push over the people, because I always say democracy has a content and then it has a form. The US pushing the form of it because it is through that form that it manages to control the results. They accept the outcome of a democratic process only if the result is in favor of the United States. Every time the results of any formal democratic process has been something that US doesn't like or it's not in their interest, they immediately refuse to recognize the results and organize coups, sabotages, everything else to reverse that process. And we know that. So the claim that they are for democracy is just a hoax, just a cover. That is not the issue. If you look at the content of democracy, democracy, in my view, exists only when the governing body, it's the state, represents the will of the majority of people. That is the content of democracy. And I don't see it as a formal thing. The same way they define human rights. For example, for them, it has no economic side. It's just human rights from the point of view of the United States for the people who support the United States inside any country. Their rights should be respected. Nobody else's right matters. The same with the democratic process. the lackeys of the United States, the agents of the United States, the supporters of the United States in every country have the right to rule. That's the principle. Now, if the results turn out otherwise, that's the end of democracy, according to the United States. They don't see that in all of these cases, if you look at it, U.S. push for democracy has been push for the rule of minority. Always, without exception. And finally, if you look at it from as a matter of principle and even theoretical, philosophical one, imperialism is contradictory to democracy. You cannot have both at the same time. You cannot have imperialist control and democracy in any country, because as soon as people can democratically exercise their rights, their first step is to get rid of imperialist control of their country. So there's no way U.S. can genuinely call for democracy. It is against its own interests. It reshapes democracy in a way that serves its own purpose, and that's what it is.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the U.S. has never been democratic. It was never, ever. The idea of democracy that the settler colonial entity of the United States for is a farce. It's false. It's a giant lie. So for me, I wouldn't trust anything that comes out of the U.S. now, regardless of who's in power. I don't care, Republican or Democrat. Settler colonial imperialist is a settler colonial imperialist. And they're going to always try to hold on to power, dominance, control over resources, whether those are human resources or natural resources. And we must acknowledge that those same contradictions exist anywhere that imperialism has existed, which includes Latin America. So we have a lot of unpacking of our own to do in our portion of the Western Hemisphere over our long history of colonialism and imperialism before the U.S. began. However, in many respects, there are more advancements toward decolonization, a deeper decolonization happening in the southern half of the Western Hemisphere than in the northern half of the Western Hemisphere. And I believe that also poses a threat to the U.S.'s idea of, as Bahman described, that false democracy. Because when you have something that I really admired that Chavez was attempting was to balance. And again, I'm not speaking from personal lived experience. I'm not indigenous in Venezuela. What I can see and observe is an attempt to shift toward a more decolonial way of life, similar in Bolivia. So if the shifts that are taking place in Latin America destabilize existing colonial powers, regardless of which empire they came from. And that's setting an example for the people in the northern half of the Western Hemisphere, holding on to colonialism, imperialism. Then that's another reason I think the success we see of the whole "it's for democracy" narrative is happening, because I think folks in the U.S. still haven't necessarily grappled with decolonization, aren't really grappling with, or maybe haven't had the opportunity to grapple with. Say it more like that, to be fair, because when does the working class have an opportunity to breathe, much less deal with these very complex contradictions? So I think that has a lot to do with it as well, because if the U.S. can control the narrative about what democracy is, what it looks like, and how it operates, and they can control how that works in other countries, then they can keep control over the natural resources. Then they can keep control over the working class inside the U.S. as well. So I think it all ties together. And I wish here in Puerto Rico that, because here the narratives around Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, etc., are very controlled by the opposition in those places, are very controlled by imperialism, very controlled by our ruling class, which is primarily people from those places that left when they were confronted with accountability by the people they were exploiting. I'm hoping that people listening and that folks who may encounter this later on down the line, as things continue to evolve and accelerate inside the imperial core, just remember that if we're not going to trust what the US says about Palestine, why are we the US says about Venezuela? If we're not going to trust what the US says about any other country that we're in solidarity with, why are we going to trust it about Venezuela or Cuba or any place in Latin America? You can't one side of your mouth say you're anti-imperialist or anti-colonial or pro-working class, and then out of the other side of your mouth, regurgitate US state talking points about a country like Venezuela. It's a contradiction that needs to be addressed and resolved, hopefully sooner than later.
Said, thank you. I think this is a good place for us to wrap up today. Dr. Azad, thank you so much for coming to the show and sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. It was a pleasure having you and discuss this topic with you. Thank you, Manisha, for inviting Dr. Azad to enlighten us with his word and his experience. Any last comments before we depart, Doctor?
First of all, I thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Manisha. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this important discussion. One thing that I probably emphasize at the end is the global nature of what is going on. Understanding that Palestine is linked to Venezuela. What is going on there is also part and parcel of the same process of oppression that is going on. The more the balance of forces in the world change toward the multipolar world, the US is losing its grip over the international situation. And as it gets more desperate, it resorts to more violent, paralegal methods of oppression before that they at least observe some kind of veneer of even defending democracy. But even today, the question is not that. How can you support what is going on in Palestine in the name of defending democracy? There's a contradiction there that we can see only if we look at things from a global perspective and see what the US is doing and the inconsistencies that exist in every word that utter in terms of democracy, in terms of human rights, in terms of welfare of the people and everything else. We have to put all of these together to see the real intentions behind these actions. It's not just personal fight against Maduro. It's not personal fight against Ortega or against Iranian leadership. It's a one project that is going on. And as they get more desperate, they resort to more violent methods of doing it. And we should expect more and be prepared for it.
Absolutely. Manisha, any last words?
Yeah, a point I wish I'd made earlier is that I don't think it matters who is president of Venezuela if they're from the party that is advancing the cause of liberation for the people. It's Maduro. It doesn't have to be Maduro. It could be anyone. The U.S. would be behaving in the same manner.
It's a
Whoever
project
the
trying to reverse.
exactly, it's the project. So try not to get caught up in Maduro this, Maduro that. Look at the bigger picture, especially from the global angle that Bahman is reminding us of. None of us are going to be fully satisfied with any change process. Sometimes it's going to move slower than we want it to. Sometimes we're going to have to let go of certain aspirations in order to achieve others. It's a process. It's messy. All change is. And that doesn't mean we don't continue. And it doesn't mean that we don't give our energy toward maintaining as much as we can the shifts in power that we have been able to achieve. And we're going to need to be able to help each other do that more and more under climate change as well. So we're contending with all of it at the same time. And now isn't the time for us to get caught up in a lot of this forget Maduro, focus on the project and try to understand what's really happening underneath all of this talk, all of propaganda and all of this psychological warfare as much as you can, and look at the people and support the people. If the people want Maduro in power, leave it alone. They're getting some benefit from that. And the working class around the world needs to be able to shift power back into their own hands and by whatever means necessary.
Exactly. I agree. Dr. Assad, again, thank you. Where can people plug into your work, know what you're doing, and support?
I don't have any personal link, but the U.S. Peace Council, it's uspeacecouncil.org. We have our website, we have our Facebook page, and we issue our statements and all that. But if anybody wants to contact me, it's uspc@uspeacecouncil.org.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you again for coming. And thank all of you for listening to us today. Please like us, subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so. YouTube, X, Telegram, look us up anywhere you listen to podcasts, and share us with your friends so we can grow. Thank you again, and stay tuned for our next show. Take care.
Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that. In addition, any support we receive makes sure we can continue to provide our main episodes free for everyone. And for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Ren Jacob, and Helgeberg. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch.
We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.